Hi there and welcome to this IB biology video, and this is for the independent project that we're setting, and this is for booklet 1. So this is going to be a bit different from other videos. This is going to be a long video, but you obviously do not have to do it all in one go. So this focus of this booklet is ecosystems and adaptations for survival, which covers the two areas of the courses identified there from the IB specification, which is B4.1 and B4.2. And everything in this video is needed for students doing both standard level and higher level. Pointing out for you, hopefully the obvious of this video is to give you the basics, to make sure you understand the content, but you should also be using your IB textbook and the links provided in the booklet to ensure you have a full understanding. Please speak to your teacher if you struggle with anything on this, or myself, Mr. Phillips, and be aware that this will be assessed in examinations. The reason we're doing this is to free up more time for the more challenging content and to develop your independent working skills, but this will be assessed in tests during the next 2 years and in the final examinations. Please do not assume this content is not important. So part one then that we're going to look at today is ecosystems and adaptations, and the idea of this is we're going to study ecosystems and adaptations so you can answer the guiding question from the specification: how are the adaptations and habitats of species related? So you need to understand that habitats are where organisms live. I think most people can do that, and the entire ecosystem it can be an entire ecosystem and all the abiotic factors involved. Organisms must be adapted to the abiotic factors of an ecosystem, and this is obviously more obvious in extreme environments like deserts or Arctic, and we'll be looking at some of those during the course of this project. You do need to understand the term an adaptation, so you wouldn't need to be able to provide an absolutely specific one, but something along the lines of an adaptation is a characteristic of an organism that improves its chance of surviving and or reproducing. So the first piece of work you've got to do, and I'm not going to go into this massively, is about sand dunes. So let's just have a quick look at sand dunes and how they're created. So a sand dune obviously is moving in from the sea, and your sand dunes get more and more stable as you move away from the sea into land. So the first thing that happens is obviously when you're by the sea there is an onshore breeze, so the wind is coming in. That wind will move sand along the beach, and obstacles such as driftwood and bits of litter as well will end up going onto the beach. The wind will blow the sand into these obstacles where it gets trapped, and then what can happen is organisms called colonizer plants or colonizer or pioneer plants like marron grass can grow on those sand dunes. They stabilize it, and that they slowly develop roots. It creates something called an embryo dune, which is where it starts to turn from almost into little sand dunes, and then the plants die and they'll actually add to the organic matter in this and start turning the sand into what we'd consider more as soil. Obviously the conditions are difficult on a sand dune. There's very little minerals in the sand dune. There might be very little water available. The dunes are constantly moving. There might be exposure to temperatures, and plants like marron grass and lime grass have to be adapted to reduce their water loss massively. Now notice I've just said that question free. You actually need to know how they're adapted, not just why they're adapted. You'll then also be asked to use this link to research mangrove swamps. And again, I'm not going to go over those, just to point out that the mangrove trees are these entire trees here. So they have roots that are in the often estuary, tropical, swampy waters, and they can grow up. Now they're essential for coastlines for both humans because they stop storm surges, they'll help us against the extreme weather, but also they are absolutely vital as nurseries for breeding fish, where young fish can safely grow for the first few months of their lives. So that is one of the key pieces that you have to research. So sand dunes and mangrove swamps are two case studies you're expected to know, so please spend some time answering those questions on the project. So then what we need to know is that there are different factors can affect communities, and we will look at this a couple of times over the next parts of these projects because they all sort of come back to this point. There are abiotic things, or abiotic factors I should say, that are non-living factors, so things that aren't created by other living organisms, and biotic things which are living factors. And these can affect the population size of an ecosystem by affecting what we call the carrying capacity of that ecosystem, how many individuals of a species it can hold and support. So I always think about plants when I think about abiotic abiotic factors, and I always think about plants because I think about what does a plant need to grow, and it sort of goes down that list when I think about this. Sorry. So I know that plants need light, and light intensity is important. Plants need light for photosynthesis. So the higher the light intensity, normally the higher the growth of plants. Temperature. All living things, plants as well, need temperature because enzymes are controlled by temperature. They don't want to be too hot because the enzymes get denatured. They don't want to be too low because the temperature will be too low for the enzymes. Moisture levels. All living things need water. There's so many roles of water. If you go back to the first few lessons you'll do in biological molecules on this course. Soil pH, mineral content. Well, if the pH is wrong, it will denature enzymes, prevent the plants from growing. Minerals are needed. So, for example, the mineral magnesium is absolutely essential in making chlorophyll. So if you don't have magnesium in the soil, you won't have any chlorophyll. And nitrogen or nitrate in the form of nitrates is vital for growth. Wind intensity. If it's really too windy, plants won't be able to stand up and grow. Oxygen availability. So again, if we don't think about plants for a minute, we think about all living organisms need oxygen for aerobic respiration. And carbon dioxide availability. Again, anything like plants or algae that do photosynthesis need carbon dioxide to do it. So whilst I always think of it as plants, it applies to all living organisms, and those are the essential abiotic factors for growth. And then biotic factors, we're not going to focus on massively at the moment, but food availability. So if you're a herbivore, you need plants to eat. If you're a carnivore, you need other animals to eat. Pathogens, don't forget they're caused. Bacteria are living things, fungus are living things, so therefore some pathogens are living organisms, and they're spread by other living organisms in communicable diseases. Predation, obviously if you're being eaten, then you are being eaten by a living thing. And interspecific competition means competition between two different organisms. Now, abiotic factors, therefore, will affect where species can live, and this affects what we call their distribution. And we might see something called a distribution maps, which show us where species can live. And what will happen is that most species will have a range, we call it a range of tolerance, and this can be seen in here. And you can see that the range of tolerance is there's like a area that is a preference area, a suitable area where they can live. Most will live in the best conditions, but then less and less of those species will survive as you go away from those normal conditions. So there's a certain tolerance zone which a species can live, and you can investigate this by using quadrats and looking at how conditions change to how numbers of species change. And you'll do about quadrats in the module leading up to the internal assessment. One area which there isn't a massive amount of information on, but it is important, is rock pools. So rock pools have a constantly changing abiotic, conditions. And one thing that changes in a rock pool constantly as the tide goes in and out is the levels of carbon dioxide. Because if it becomes a pool and the water is if the water is getting more and more carbon dioxide because the carbon dioxide is building due to respiration, then the pH will get lower, more acidic, and the pH will get higher if there is less carbon dioxide. Now this will depend on the depth of the rock pool, but oxygen levels and carbon dioxide levels will change in the rock pool depending on different situations. So if the tide is out and you're left with just a rock pool, you may have more oxygen diffusing into the shallow water, but also there might be less photosynthesis able to happen because there might be, in that little pool, there might be less plants, and therefore carbon dioxide levels will build up. And they have to be tolerant to a range of conditions in the rock pool because it's constantly changing, and therefore every day they'll have different extremes of conditions. Now, one place which we need to study a little bit more, where there is a high level of biodiversity, which means a high level of living organisms in there, is the coral reefs. So here you can see the best way, unfortunately, to see where the coral reefs are on the planet is to look at where they've been damaged. And you can see they've been damaged almost everywhere where they exist. But the coral reefs have this sort of clear area here where they exist. And that is hopefully pretty obvious to you, sort of from here to sort of here. Now, where that is on the Earth is basically between in the tropics, so between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Now, the reason for that is because of their abiotic factors. The conditions need to be perfect for coral to grow, because coral is effectively an algae which has an exoskeleton on the outside, and the conditions need to be suitable for the production of that exoskeleton and for the success of the algae. And you are expected to be able to explain each of the following reasons as to what or why each of these abiotic factors are important. So if we have a look at them, the first one is depth. So the depth for coral reef has to be less than 50 meters deep in the water. Now, this is because the coral reef is surviving because of the autotrophic nature of the algae. The algae is doing photosynthesis, and you should know from earlier studies you need light to complete photosynthesis, and that is producing the food which starts the food chain of the coral. Next one, pH. So the pH has to be alkaline because the algae is completing reactions to produce calcium carbonate, the hard coral, like the shell, if you think of it, of the coral itself. If it goes below into acidic levels, this is when acidification of the corals occur, which is coral bleaching, which is something you'll study in the climate change part of Project 3. Salinity has to be at a certain level within the ocean, and that is to prevent osmosis of the algae happening uncontrollably, and that is something that all sea creatures have to deal with. There has to be a level of clarity or a reduction in sedimentation. Basically, the water has to be clear to allow light to penetrate through it. It's no good being at a low depth, but actually having soil everywhere, causing no sun to be able to get through. Temperature has to be between 23 to 29 degrees C on average, which is allowing it to for enzymes to work efficiently in the algae. And obviously those things are absolutely essential. You will also be asked as part of that work to complete a study on the case study in the booklet about coral bleaching as well, which doesn't use this video. Okay, so let's look at part 2 then. So part 2 we are looking at biomes, and biomes are key because if you look at the map on the world there, it shows you where all the different types of ecosystems are sort of grouped in these things called. So we need to understand what a biome is, and so a biome is sorry, I'm just messing with my pen. A biome is a collection of ecosystems sharing similar climatic conditions, and there is a difference in opinion on what type of biomes there are, but we will stick with the following: aquatic marine, aquatic freshwater, deserts, forests, of which we do need to recognise there are different types of forests: tropical in tropical countries like the Amazon, temperate like in the UK, and boreal, which is stuff like in Alaska and places like that. And grasslands and tundra. Now, a tundra is is an area where there's very little growth of plants because of very limited conditions. So this means that we need to understand that each biome has specific characteristics. Each biome will have certain limiting factors. So it might be that it's got very little nutrients in the soil. It might be that it has low biodiversity or high biodiversity, productivity, how quickly the plants grow, and then insolation, which is a term you need to understand even though we don't use it that much, which is the amount of solar radiation given on a surface. So places near the equator have the highest levels of insolation around the world because that's where most of the sun shines. Precipitation, obviously how much it rains, and temperature. So when we're talking about biomes, you need to understand why are there these different areas. Why is, if you have a look at the graph on the left, why is it, let me just put my pointer on, that boreal forests occur in this sort of region here, but actually temperate forests occur here and here, and then we have our tropical forests here. Why are they selected to certain parts of the world? We can't just say climate, you have to be more specific than just saying climate. And basically it is due to the abiotic factors. And the two abiotic factors that affect more than anything is precipitation and temperature. If there was a third one there, I would say the third one is going to be your insolation, but you focus on these two because they have clear effects on what grows where. So if we look at temperature first of all, you can see on this map of the Earth, the temperature in the middle of the planet is obviously the hottest. That, as long as you've got lots of water, that is going to create lots of growth. So it is important. You can see here we have places where there's desert here, and that is where the temperature is very hot, even though actually if you look along the equator it should be hotter here, but actually they have water. So if you've got the right amounts of temperature, the high temperatures and high levels of precipitation, you are then going to have high productivity of growth. If you have less temperature, so you go towards the poles, you'd expect less growth because again temperature directly affects enzyme activity, which will affect productivity, and then precipitation is essential for all life. Now it is important to remember that it's not just about lines of latitude and where on the Earth you are. If you go up mountains, as you gradually go up mountains, something called zonation appears. So you'll have really different levels of plants lower down the mountain as to high altitudes, and then when you get high enough, nothing can really survive. And again, that is actually due to temperature because you get colder as you go to higher altitudes. So precipitation and evaporation are the two main abiotic factors. So precipitation being moisture availability and evaporation affected by temperature. And this therefore means it can rain a lot, but how much water evaporates. And the temperature links to both evaporation and also I suppose freezing as well. Rainfall is important, but the plants have to be able to do something with that in order to survive. So there's something called the precipitation evaporation ratio, which when it is 1, that is means the rate is the same, and that's when soil is at its most rich and fertile levels. So if you have a look here at the different levels, you would have to do obviously precipitation divided by evaporation. Here you could see that the global level is almost 1, okay, but then different parts of the globe have different levels. So if we think about, maybe you might think about Africa as an area that's got lots of drought in different areas. The whole of Africa as a whole has more evaporation than it does precipitation, and that's why you have areas of desert and there might be famines. Whereas if you think about maybe South America, which again you might think, well, the Amazon, but actually there is more evaporation than precipitation because again there are more deserty areas there as well. If you think about somewhere that might be sort of similar, let's have a look. Sort of, well, I can't really see, there aren't really many areas that are similar, but you can use these things to calculate the ratio and therefore how much soil there should be, and therefore how, if they've got a good soil quality, what the level of productivity is. Here you can see a map of productivity, and you can see that the darkest green areas are where the highest productivity is again. So areas where there's lots of temperature, but also lots of water availability is where we get our big rainforests across the world with that high level of productivity. And this can be mapped, you can compare, you can actually work out what type of biome will be present based upon how much precipitation there is and how much temperature there is. So you can see here, if your annual precipitation rate is low and your temperature is moderate, your temperature is high, I was reading it wrong here because that's 30 degrees, then you have a subtropical desert, whereas if you go all the way down here, your tundra is low temperature average, but it's and also has a low precipitation actually, then that means you've got that tropical rainforests have high precipitation and high temperatures. So you've been asked to do some research on one particular type of biome. You can pick this yourself, you can look at it yourself, but please think about a biome that might link to other parts of the course. So you are asked to study about deserts, you are asked to study about the tropical rainforest. So I would suggest probably focus on one of those more, which might help you with other areas of the course. Now, a term that we'll come back to at a different point in the course is convergent evolution. And this is an example where you see convergent evolution around the world. And what convergent evolution is when there appears to be organisms with the same adaptations that have never seen each other in the natural world. So you might have something here, for example, living in sort of the United States that has the same evolutionary adaptations as something in Madagascar. Now, they haven't evolved and then separated due to continental drift, because they would have been miles away on the original landmass. Why they've evolved to have similar structures is because the similar biomes around the world have developed due to similar abiotic conditions. So it must be here and over here, for example, they must have a similar level of rainfall, a similar temperature, and possibly similar insolation, so level of sunlight. And therefore the organisms in that part of the world have adapted to have similar adaptations because they've adapted to similar conditions, but they were never evolutionarily linked together as close relatives. So it's not they're closely related, they've just evolved to the same similar abiotic conditions, and therefore the same traits have been successful and passed on through natural selection. So you need to know a couple of examples of where we see adaptations, and obviously the desert is a key area. So you need to understand that deserts, and you can have deserts that are not hot, so we are being specific here. Something like the Sahara Desert is a hot desert. In the daytime temperatures are very high. At night time, normally because of no cloud cover, the temperatures fall really hot quickly at night time. There is very, very limited rainfall, so that is obviously a massive issue. And because there's very limited life, there's very limited soil development, very few minerals and nutrients in there. Obviously, sand is the main structure of soil. Now, you've been asked to study these different videos to look at how cacti are adapted and then how camels are adapted. So I'm not going to go through these. There are two very good videos linked on there for you to use and identify the key adaptations. And again, for camels, please be aware the camel video or the desert animal video does feel a little bit childish, but it is worth you seeing and quickly answering those questions. And then there is a research task for you to do. The Saguaro cactus is your typical cactus you think of, and the fennec fox are two species that have adapted to survive in the desert, obviously plant and animal. It's important you can learn their adaptations and then apply them to other given examples. So for example, the fox here has got large surface area on its ears, which allow more heat to be radiated out. It's got good eyesight, so it can be a nocturnal animal, so it can come out at night time, so behavioural adaptations. And then its tail has got certain colours on it on the bottom to help it stay warm or cold, depending on what time of day it is. Tropical rainforest then, again you need to know this. Another example of biome conditions in tropical rainforest are always high temperatures, always high precipitation in a healthy rainforest, and high light levels because they're near the equator, producing high productivity, high levels of photosynthesis for life. And again, I'm asking you to do some research on this, which I'm not going to go through. Two species, I want to identify their adaptations. So you've got the Moranti tree here and the spider monkey, which are for you to look at for yourself. So then part 3 is looking at something called ecological niches. An ecological niche and linking it to feeding within ecosystems. So the niche is a key word. Some people call it a niche. I call it a niche. A key word that people do get confused with, and you will see different interpretations of this word. But what I would say is it is the role a species plays within its habitat. Some people would say it's the position of a species in the habitat. I prefer the word role because it specifies it. And it can include any biotic interactions. So for example, in this example here, you've got the shark plays the part of the apex predator, so its role is eating the other organisms, whereas a seaweed is the photosynthesizer, so absorbing the sunlight and creating the food for the food chain. Or it could be that it has abiotic interactions, so it could be the time of day it's active, so it might be at night time. It has a particular role as a nighttime predator because it hunts at night time only. And only one species can fully occupy one niche. And if there's two species within the same niche, so imagine this bird example here with the angry birds, if there were lots of species inhabiting the same niche, so lots of yellow birds inhabited and red bird inhabited the top one, there would be competition, interspecific competition between the two. So species will obviously share habitats, we know that, and a specific role within an ecosystem, the role is called the niche. Now there are different words for niches then, so there's what we call a fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the fundamental niche is basically the total range of conditions that a species can theoretically tolerate, but the realized niche is actually which portions of fundamental niche will it actually live in. So it's the actual conditions and resources in which the species exists, and that's due to biotic interactions. So it might be that we're predicting that fish can live in this entire area here, but actually the fish we're looking at may not be able to live in these red areas due to some other competition that we're not aware of. And there is something called competition or competitive exclusion principle. And this is the idea that if two fundamental niches overlap for a species, if two species have two niches overlap, one species will be excluded from that, possibly to the point of extinction, but excluded from that niche. And we know this because of a study using beetles. So we have two forms of beetles here. One of them is on their own, they will live quite happily, but when you put them together, they will compete, and one species will outcompete the other one. So this has been proven to happen in a lab and has been seen in the natural world as well. So again, we've talked about abiotic factors. You need to understand different abiotic factors. You need to be able to look at an area and suggest abiotic factors. So if we look at this one here, this is a coral reef. We talked about the abiotic factors needed there earlier on: light intensity, a lack of sedimentation, the right pH, it needs to be alkaline, the right temperature, somewhere between 23 and 29 degrees, I think it was. Okay, so you need to be able to suggest the reasons for this. Similarly, in a pond, similar sort of things as what I just said there, apart from the salinity wouldn't be an important issue. And even on any landscape, so up a mountain, you might need to suggest why the changes are there, obviously due to difference in temperature, possibly due to differences in insulation. So again, I'm not going to go through these, but there's some abiotic factors for you. Again, they greatly impact population size because they'll affect the competition. If they're poor conditions, there'll be more competition. If there's good conditions, maybe less competition as a result. Biotic factors are also important. So I'm going to put up 6 pictures here and explain these biotic factors, and they all affect what we call the carrying capacity of an ecosystem for a species. So for example, the carrying capacity is how many members of that species can exist in that ecosystem. So we have a look at these. We've got this one here. So biotic factor here. This is competition. Two different species competing for a kill. The hyena and the lions competing for whatever they have killed. So obviously the more competition there is, the less of those species are going to be able to survive. You've then got disease. Well, obviously the more bacteria, the more fungus present, the more the less likely, the more pathogens are present, the less likely you're going to be have a high carrying capacity. We've got here, and you might think this one is predation. It isn't. This is mutualistic relationships or symbiotic relationships. So the bird here is not going to be eaten by that crocodile. It is going to help the crocodile by removing bits of old decaying dead animals from its teeth, preventing it getting infection, and therefore the bird gets food, it benefits, the crocodile doesn't get tooth decay, which would be really bad for a crocodile. We then get parasitism, which is where parasites feed on you. So in this case it's not mutualistic like the previous example. The cat is getting an irritation, the tick gets to feed on the cat, so therefore it is a negative connotation. Predation, obviously the shark here is getting the food by eating the seal is getting killed. And then herbivoration, or being a herbivore, how much plants are available for you as a right. So I think that's herbivory, I should have said. So biotic factors can greatly affect population size and new food sources coming in, removal of the food source. So let's say that shark, all the seals died out for some reason, then the shark populations will be greatly affected as well. If a new predator arrives, so I know in South Africa sharks have been hunted now by orcas, and that has greatly reduced the shark numbers. That can affect the population. A new pathogen, so a new disease arrives, a new bacteria arrives, or a virus being carried by a new invasive species coming in, or new competitors such as red squirrels being outcompeted by the grey squirrels. And please remember that new competitor one, because people often forget that. Now, particularly important, because we will think about mostly, when we think about conservation and adaptations, we think about animals and plants, but it is important to remember particularly that life is important, like of all different levels, and bacterial level is important as well. So there is a key, obviously we talked about before, oxygen is a key abiotic factor. And there are different types of what we call aerobes or anaerobes. So you are what we call an obligate aerobe. You need to have oxygen to respire aerobically or you will die. And therefore you're an obligate anaerobe. And basically you can only grow successfully if you use aerobic respiration. If you do anaerobic for much longer than a minute or so, you won't be alive. This will obviously generally occur where there's high levels of oxygen, and animals and plants are adapted to do this. Facultative anaerobes are organisms that can grow in both aerobic and anaerobic conditions, but they will have greater growth in oxygen-rich conditions. So they prefer to do aerobic respiration and will grow in those conditions as opposed to anaerobic. Obligate anaerobes are organisms that can only grow in anaerobic conditions when there is no oxygen available. You do not need to know these last two, D and E. So we're going to look at nutrition and gaining energy to finish off this area, and this is terms that you will come across when you do photosynthesis and respiration in lessons as well. But there are two key what we call trophs, autotrophs and heterotrophs. So organisms might be autotrophs, which then they will make organic compounds or food from their inorganic compounds. So the example that we're most likely linked to this is photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis, plants turn carbon dioxide, which is an inorganic molecule, and water, which is an inorganic molecule, H2O, into glucose, and you hopefully know glucose is C6H12O6. Now glucose can then be further made into other organic compounds. So therefore it's a constantly moving thing. So that glucose can be turned into proteins and fats, etc. Heterotrophs, which we are part of heterotrophs, feed on other organisms to gain our organic compounds. So we eat plants. Anything other than the plant or the producer in the food chain is a heterotroph. Now there are some organisms that can do both methods. So there's an example of something called a protist, which can use both autotrophs and heterotrophs. So the Euglena gracilis has chloroplasts, which means it can do photosynthesis, okay, but it can also feed on smaller organisms using endocytosis, where it absorbs things into the cell. So therefore it can do both of these. And some organisms, you don't need to really know examples, can be facultative mixotrophs, so they can choose when and where they do both of them, and some are obligate, so they always have to do both in order to survive. Now obviously photosynthesis is a module you'll study in massive detail, so we're only going to mention this really quickly, but there are 3 groups that can do photosynthesis: plants, eukaryotic algae, and bacteria, including cyanobacteria, which you often see as blue-green algae. Archaea cannot do photosynthesis. So when you do the 3 domains, you'll hear about archaea. They are not able to do photosynthesis because they do not have chloroplasts. Okay. Now photosynthesis is often vital in creating the biomes that we've just talked about, because they create the conditions, the abiotic conditions needed for certain niches. So underwater, for example, photosynthesis absorbs carbon dioxide, preventing the water from getting too acidic, and releases oxygen, making the other organisms able to respire. So I've asked you to study these plants and identify how they can absorb maximum light. So for example, the shape of their leaves and the amount of chloroplasts they have. So please look that up in your own time. So now we're going to look at something called holozoic nutrition. And we already have said that animals are heterotrophs because they gain carbon compounds from consuming their food. So if I eat a chicken burger, I'm gaining my carbon compound, my proteins, my sugars, my lipids from that. But also I am holozoic, and that is because I eat whole pieces of food and internally digest it. And you need to know the basic stages of that. So stage 1 is ingestion. I intake the food, okay, through the mouth. Stage 2, I then digest it. And digestion is the conversion of large, and I would actually say large insoluble molecules, okay, into small, simpler, soluble molecules. I then need to absorb it. So some people link those two together, but once you've digested the food, it's still in your small intestines. I then need to absorb it via the villi of my small intestines through various methods, which you'll look at at different points, into the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, I then need to, where I need it to go, I need to assimilate it. So basically I need to use that energy for myself, and then there is something called egestion, which is where I release the waste products out of my body, and that can be excretion if I've made the products myself. So there are some microbes or some organisms you need to know about, which you will talk about in the cycles part of the course as well. But we've always called these decomposers until this point. But decomposers, the proper name is saprobionts, and they feed on the remains of dead organisms and their waste products. So they are the things that are extremely useful for us to break down feces and urine. So we couldn't use sewage works and break down our sewage if we didn't know about these. And they use a particular type of digestion called extracellular digestion, where they break down complex organic materials such as proteins back down into simpler organic ones, which is called saprobiotic nutrition. So here you've got an example of fungus, and what fungus does is fungus releases enzymes out into the neighbouring area that digests the organic material, then they absorb it back into their body as a result. And fungus could be mushrooms, for example, in that picture. So how does it work? Well, they release digestive enzymes. Digestion, if you remember from the biomolecules part of the course, is always a hydrolysis reaction. So this hydrolyzes organic materials. They then absorb these nutrients for themselves, and they'll leave some nutrients in the soil which others can absorb as well, including our plants. They may also release other waste materials, but you don't need to worry about that. Fungus aren't the only extracellular digestive organisms though. Humans also do the same, because we release enzymes from our cells into our digestive system, out of our cells, and unicellular organisms and fungi can also complete endocytosis, where they absorb materials into their cells. And remember, digestion is always a hydrolysis reaction. Archaea are different, so when you do the three domains, one of the three domains is archaea. They are adapted to live in such extreme environments such as hot springs or salt lakes. They are difficult to culture, so there's very little we know about these, but they have three types of nutrition. They are phototrophic. Now that contradicts what I said earlier, because I said they don't do photosynthesis. They don't do photosynthesis because they do not have chlorophyll, but they still can absorb light and use it to make some sort of compounds. So that's that. They are chemotrophic, so they can oxidize chemicals such as ions to release energy. And they are heterotrophic. They'll obtain some carbon compounds from other organisms like we do. Now, we've had to adapt as holozoic nutrition organisms to get for our diets. We are all part of the family Hominidae, I can never say that. We are humans, orangutans, gorillas, and chimps. And some of those members of the family are herbivores, and if they're herbivores, they tend to have large, flat teeth to grind down plant material. Okay, and the ones that are omnivores tend to have a mixture of teeth to break down both meat and plants. So you'll have, if you're more likely to eat meat, you're more likely to have the canines at the front as opposed to the flat teeth at the back. And herbivores themselves, whether it's insects, also have adaptations. So insects even show adaptations. They are homologous, they've evolved from common ancestors, they've diverged to become different. So some insects, such as beetles, have a jaw for biting and chewing leaves, whereas aphids, as in the picture, have a tubular mouth for sort of sucking up their liquids from the stem. So you can see the tubular mouth here. There you go, which can stab into a stem and suck the sugars out through that. It's called the proboscis. Plants have evolved to defend themselves against these organisms as a result, obviously, the adaptations to stop themselves being eaten, and the deterrent for that is they'll have sharp spines, stinging chemicals, toxic chemicals in the nutrient-rich parts of the plant. Okay, the last thing we'd like you to do is do some research on how each of these organisms are adapted to either be the predator and to kill the prey or hunt the prey, or the prey and prevent themselves being eaten. But it is important you know these terms, that there are different things. There are physical adaptations, chemical adaptations, and behavioural adaptations. So physical adaptations mean anatomical. So for example, the vampire bat is going to have fangs to kill its prey, it's going to be able to fly to catch the prey, etc., and it's going to have echolocation to find the prey. The moth is, however, going to potentially be able to do some things. You can look at how to stop it using its body. Chemical adaptations, so we've got the black mamba here. Well, that's obviously going to have venom to kill the prey, and that's going to mean that it's using a chemical to do so. But then some organisms might produce chemicals to make themselves taste horrible, and therefore that is also a chemical adaptation. And then behavioural adaptations might be anything animals or plants, or animals in this case, do to hunt or to prevent being hunted. So that could be anything from laying in wait and ambushing prey, or it could be anything like lying and pretending you're dead to prevent prey seeing you. So there's lots of adaptations in there.